Hey guys, it's Johnny from Ignite. Welcome to a brand new video. Today we're going to be looking at the craft of writing, specifically how to adapt your draft composition for the craft of writing to any visual stimulus. But before we get started, please make sure if you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and comment below. And we would appreciate any feedback for future videos that you may be interested in. If you also want extra resources, please check out ignitehsc.com.au and you will find everything you need right there. And without further ado, let's get into the video. Okay, so when we're dealing with the craft of writing in an exam scenario and you're asked to compose a particular type of composition, often you'll be presented with, and almost always you'll be presented with, a stimulus. Today we're going to be looking at visual stimuli in particular. And what a lot of students struggle to do is to take the work they've done in their draft compositions and actually adapt it and make that material usable and relevant in the particular exam when they're confronted with a visual stimulus that doesn't look that usable or relevant. The problem there, of course, is that students are thinking too narrowly about what a stimulus could mean. So what I'm going to introduce you to right now is a huge concept. I mean, it's very simple. It's just going to be this one word. But to me, it actually captures a lot of what you need to do in the exam when you're trying to unpack a stimulus and interpret a stimulus. And that is that you need to give life to the stimulus. So if we're dealing with a visual stimulus, we want to give life to it. That means we want to interpret it in as broadly a way as possible so that you're not confined in the way you're interpreting it and therefore forced to let go of all that beautiful draft material that you worked so hard throughout the whole year to use and to demonstrate your expertise in English with in the exam. Okay, a lot of students will abandon it if they get a tough stimulus, if they get an image that doesn't seem to make sense with the thing that they wanted to talk about in the first place. But the problem is not the stimulus. The problem is the way you're thinking about the stimulus. You're not giving life to the stimulus. You're really interpreting it in a very dead way. There's only one literal way of interpreting that stimulus. That's the way a lot of people go. They'll see an image, let's say, of the ocean, and we'll look at this in a second, and they'll think, unless my composition is about a physical ocean, unless I'm set in the sea, then the piece that I had drafted is no longer usable. I'll have to write something from scratch. Well, that's a disaster because you only have 20, maximum 40 minutes, depending on how many marks the composition aspect of the craft of writing task is, to actually demonstrate that you are at that band 6 level, that you're capable of writing with flair and sophistication. The best way to do that is to use as much material you had polished from beforehand and actually reproduce that, albeit in a way that's adapted and answers the question that you are presented with. So the key is to make the stimulus work for you, not the other way around. Okay, it's not about making what you have work to the stimulus. It's about making the stimulus work for what you have. So we're going to give life to the stimulus. All say it at home as you're watching on your computer, life. Okay, so what does life actually mean? The L in life means literal. So you can interpret a stimulus literally. So if you see a picture of an ocean, you can think, okay, that's actually a setting of an ocean, so I'm going to write a composition about someone in an ocean. That's a very literal and rather narrow way of interpreting it, but unless you actually have written a composition that's set in the ocean, that way is not going to be very usable for you. It's not going to be very user-friendly. When you approach the stimulus, you don't want to have to feel that you have to interpret it literally. Otherwise, you're going to be kind of cornered and you're probably going to freak out and abandon ship, so to speak, right? You're going to abandon ship and just write a fresh piece, which you shouldn't do unless you're really well practiced at doing. Or you're actually going to write the draft composition that you were going into the exam with and not even respond at all to the stimulus. One of those two things is going to happen. You're going to abandon the stimulus and write what you already had, and then you're going to lose marks because you're not addressing the actual question and stimulus. Or you're going to write something from scratch that's just not going to sound that sophisticated. And to be frank, it's not going to sound that good. Again, unless you have practice doing that a lot, which you should. Okay, so what about the I in life? Internalize the stimulus. This is a game changer for students. This is game-changing stuff right here, right? Not to toot my own horn. But if you internalize the stimulus, so if you see the picture of an ocean and you actually take that to reflect your character's mindset, notice how it's becoming internal. It's what they're thinking or it's what they're remembering. Suddenly, you don't have to have your actual physical setting be the ocean. Suddenly, the ocean becomes something metaphorical. It becomes something that is in the person's mind that they are remembering or that they are likening their experience to. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you're going to internalize the picture of an ocean, then you could have a character remember a time they were at the ocean. So that's memory. They no longer have to actually be there. So that's one way out of it. But the second way, and the better way, I think, is to actually think about the ocean as something that you can compare the experience to. So I felt like I was in the ocean. See how I'm using a simile there? I felt like I was in the ocean, and then you can suddenly start unpacking that image a little bit more. The key thing is that you do elaborate when you do it. You don't just do one sentence and say, I felt like I was in the ocean. Okay, I dealt with the stimulus, moving on. You don't do that. You then elaborate and build a bit more of an image, a bit more of an experience for the reader. So make sure you have about 3 or 4 sentences every time that you are going to engage with the stimulus, and you should be engaging with the stimulus at least 3 distinct times throughout your piece, always at the beginning and always at the end, and you want to find some appropriate place in the middle there to work that imagery back in. So internalize means it's in the character's or the speaker's mind, and they are remembering a time at the place, or they are comparing it metaphorically, right, to the experience they're having. Powerful strategy to use. Figurative is very similar to what I just said. When you start using things in a figurative or metaphorical way, suddenly you don't have to literally have the object in the stimulus be in your piece. So again, with the ocean, you don't have to have someone at the ocean or in the ocean. You can just say, I felt like I was in the ocean, or things seemed like an ocean, or the world suddenly looked like an ocean to me. I felt like I was drowning, right? You see how I'm using that language that is to do with the ocean? That's how you want to approach it through a figurative lens, okay? So things become metaphorical. You use personification that relates to the actual image that you see. Okay, externalize. This is our last one. This is the E in life. If you're going to externalize the stimulus, then what you're going to do is, say you get the image of an ocean. So say you get the image of a fish or something like that. What you then do is, in the piece that you're writing, you talk about it as though it's some external object. For instance, the image of the ocean that's given to you in the stimulus becomes a painting that the person can see, or it becomes the image that's on the TV screen in your character's living room. So you see how we've externalized the image so that you don't have to change your setting, so you can still have your character in the living room or wherever they were, and they happen to see the picture that is represented in the stimulus. So they look over and they see a picture of the ocean. Now, it's not enough to merely say that in the piece. As I just said, you need to now expand on it. It's got to be significant. So they look at the image in the distance, right? They've seen it, and then they need to comment and reflect on it. It has to reflect something about their state of emotions or how they feel. That's the critical point. You still want it to be significant, even though by externalizing it, you're almost rendering it insignificant in a way. But that's our strategy. That's life. I will probably do another video or 2 on this idea of life, right? It's just an acronym. Just ask yourself that as soon as you see the stimulus. Let's give life to the stimulus. How can life apply in a way that suits me? You don't have to use all of those strategies. You use the ones that best suit you and the piece that you went into the exam with. Okay, so let's have a look at an example so that this all makes sense to you. If you had composed a draft composition for the craft of writing and the first sentence read like this: most people who have dared to push the limits of acceptable contemporary language would admit to have felt somewhat uncomfortable. So this is written in a persuasive form, but if you're doing an imaginative or a discursive, it doesn't matter. The principle is about how we're going to adapt this sentence. So you can apply this to any form of writing. Now this person is clearly writing about how people don't feel comfortable saying what's on their mind. So it's on political correctness, okay? But again, these things are not actually material to the point that I'm trying to make about making the links. what we'll do with this is we'll have to deal with the stimulus. So you've had that drafted piece of writing. That was your first sentence. You didn't know what the exam was going to present. Suddenly you see a picture of an ocean in the exam. You start freaking out, thinking, I was talking about political correctness. How is the ocean related? How is it going to be a key element in my composition? How is it going to be a key element? And you always have to pay attention to that particular part of the question. Is it a key setting? Is it a key element? I hope I've kept that consistent here. Here we actually have key setting, so it doesn't really matter in this case. We'll treat those as the same. But the point is we have this draft sentence, we see the picture of an ocean, and I've got to think, do I have to write something fresh that's about the ocean? No, you don't. You have to make this image work for you using life, using our life principles, by looking at it and think, what could it symbolize that relates to political correctness, to the point I'm trying to convey? Okay, so what you do is you actually have to do this. This is critical. You have to look at the image and identify the actual objects and things that you see. It's important to use those actual words in the response. It's just about how you're using them, whether it be metaphorically or as a memory, that is going to be the thing that it gives you a lot more room to move and to make your draft work. So if we're looking at this image, you can see a bottle, we can see fish, we can see the ocean, we can call it the sea, we can call it water, we can see the sky, we can see the waterline, we can see a scroll, we can see a cork. These are words that you actually want to use in the piece. So don't be confused here. When I say you're actually using it in the piece, I'm not saying that you now have to literally use the stimulus in that literal sense there. You do literally want to mention those objects, but you're using it in any of these ways, right? So I want to see those words, but we don't necessarily have to make our setting of this piece actually be that. It just has to be a key setting, but it can be a key mental setting. It can be the setting of the person's mind. It can be how they are thinking about something. It can be a metaphorical setting, okay? We've outlined a few of those items, okay? And we're going to think, what can we do with those things that make it work with what we're trying to say? Now, have a look at the adapted sentence here. Most people who have dared to push the limits of acceptable contemporary language would admit to have felt somewhat uncomfortable. Comma, we're adding now, we're improvising on the day. Like a fish hovering around an unknown object in the sea. That sounds very familiar. That's going to make a lot of sense to the marker because they're going to be thinking, hey, this person's clearly using that stimulus. No doubts in my mind that they are now engaging with that image, okay? It's so obvious, it might actually sound silly to you. It's so obvious, like a fish hovering around an unknown object, but it actually relates to what we're saying, discomfort. The fish are probably not comfortable with this random object, this man-made object floating in the sea, this kind of pollution, right? Remember the image? They're probably not comfortable. They're curious, you could say, but again, it depends on what you wanted to say in your piece. You could use it as a symbol of curiosity, but I'm using it for discomfort because that's my piece. That's what it's about. You've got to make it work for you. Now, what else did we have here? It often feels, and I should emphasize, similes. Similes are so key to use to liken the experience or liken the topic to the image, okay? And you can also apply that to quotes as well. It often feels as though the truth is being suppressed. Notice here, I'm adding more. These are new sentences that we're improvising with because we've got to elaborate. It's not enough to just refer to the stimulus once. So we're elaborating here. As though, another simile, it has been bottled up. Bottled. Wait a second. There's the bottle. We're using words that the marker can see clearly relate to the image. Don't be cryptic. Don't try and outsmart the question and not actually use those terms. I'm using bottle, but I'm not using it in a literal sense. Like, oh, I have a bottle in my hand. No, an emotion's being bottled up. I'm not meaning it in that literal sense. Hopefully you're starting to get my point. So as though it has been bottled up and lost in an ocean. So it's a simile saying something's been lost in an ocean because that bottle was lost in an ocean. Of censorship, add the of after the ocean. That way the marker can see you're engaging with it. And when you say of censorship, they know you're engaging with it on a metaphorical level. So it's a key metaphorical setting now. See how we're using life. We're not thinking narrowly about this. The last bit, it seems that we as a society are drowning in political correctness, drowning because of the water. So you think of as many terms that explicitly relate or are featured in the image, and you use those in your writing. Okay, so I hope that helps. Very elaborate. explanation there, I know, and thanks for bearing with me, especially in my more formal attire today. But I hope that really does hammer in this point that you've got to give life to the stimulus. You've got to think about it broadly. You can't think about it like it's in a box, like you can only interpret something in one way. That's crazy. This is English now. You can interpret things in thousands of ways. I've just given you 4 distinct ways of thinking about, but often they do overlap, but 4 different ways of thinking about how to interpret a stimulus. And your number one objective is to use the strategy that's going to work best for what you wanted to say so that you can preserve that nice sophistication. But do remember, practice makes perfect. You've got to practice this a lot to get really good at it. And then you can be looking at those high band 6 marks, specifically in relation to how well you have used the stimulus. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks for listening. If you're still listening this far into the video, hope to see you in another one. Please do like the video, comment. If you've got any questions, leave them below. Would love to hear feedback from you. And do subscribe to the channel, spread the word, and check out our resources because we have very comprehensive practical resources on the craft of writing, tons of examples at ignitehsc.com.au. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you.